Before power was measured in market share, it was measured in territory. Let's review the ultimate strategists. The question is why command is accepted when force alone cannot explain durable obedience. The puzzle is institutional before it is personal. A ruler may possess weapons, offices, and loyal agents, yet those instruments do not automatically create a recognized right to command. Power and legitimacy remain separate. Recognition gives command a different kind of durability. Legitimacy begins when authority appears to fit a shared framework. The framework tells participants why this office, this succession, or this institution deserves obedience. That expectation links authority to a shared order. That framework may draw from tradition, law, sacred belief, performance, ancestry, or collective necessity. The specific language changes, but the structural function remains similar. Each source creates its own standards and vulnerabilities. Now, the important point is not whether each claim inside the framework is literally true. The question is whether the framework is coherent enough to organize expectations. Coherence organizes behavior even amid disagreement. This episode examines legitimacy as an institutional relationship among belief, procedure, conduct, and continuity rather than as a decorative story attached to power. Legitimacy becomes visible through repeated institutional practice. The first problem is that force is expensive to sustain. Compliance produced only by fear requires repeated monitoring, visible punishment, and enough capacity to answer resistance. That burden grows as distance and complexity increase. Even then, coercion cannot settle ordinary decisions by itself. Most systems need people to follow rules when direct supervision is absent and immediate punishment is uncertain. Ordinary governance therefore needs more than immediate threat. Legitimacy reduces that burden by converting some obedience from an external demand into an accepted expectation. Authority becomes easier to reproduce across ordinary interactions. Acceptance lowers the daily cost of enforcement. Authority moves through institutions. When legitimacy is embedded in roles and procedures, compliance may continue even when the individual leader is distant or replaced. Recognition can attach to offices rather than personalities. The danger is that legitimacy can be mistaken for popularity. A system may be accepted because it appears proper, familiar, lawful, sacred, necessary, or procedurally valid. Acceptance can exist without affection or admiration. Likewise, legitimacy is not identical to moral justice. A widely accepted authority can still be harmful, exclusionary, or coercive, while a disputed authority may pursue defensible goals. Strategic stability and moral legitimacy must remain analytically separate. To analyze legitimacy, separate four components: the source of authority, the procedure of selection, the conduct expected from office holders, and the continuity promised by the system. Together they reveal where acceptance is produced. The source answers why authority exists. It may be framed as inherited order, collective agreement, institutional competence, sacred duty, or protection from disorder. Each source also defines what can discredit authority. The selection procedure answers why this particular office holder may command. Rules of succession, appointment, election, recognition, or confirmation make the claim operational. Procedure turns an abstract claim into a recognized transfer. The expected conduct defines what legitimate authority must do. A framework weakens when an office holder repeatedly violates the behavior that supposedly justifies the office. Conduct tests whether the office still matches its justification. Within that context, continuity matters because legitimacy is tested during transition. A system that depends heavily on one personality may struggle to transfer recognition. Transitions expose whether recognition belongs to role or person. Coherence links these components. The source, selection procedure, expected conduct, and transition process must reinforce rather than openly contradict one another. Contradiction among them creates repeated legitimacy disputes. Consistency does not mean perfection. It means that participants can understand how the system explains authority and can predict what behavior follows from that explanation. Predictability helps institutions coordinate around contested decisions. The distinction matters because a legitimacy claim becomes fragile when its public principle and operating practice move too far apart. That gap transforms routine disagreement into a structural challenge. The first mechanism is symbolic alignment. Material settings, ceremonies, architecture, and repeated procedures can make authority appear continuous, ordered, and connected to an accepted tradition. Symbols work only when institutions support their meaning. The second mechanism is procedural regularity. When similar cases are handled through recognizable processes, authority becomes less dependent on personal whim and more institutionally legible. Regularity makes authority easier to anticipate and evaluate. The third mechanism is performance. A legitimacy framework may be strengthened when the system appears capable of delivering the protection, order, judgment, or coordination it promises. Performance strengthens belief only within the framework's expectations. The fourth mechanism is distribution. Local institutions, intermediaries, and recognized roles carry the legitimacy claim outward, translating central authority into everyday decisions. Intermediaries can reinforce, modify, or weaken the central claim. The fifth mechanism is narrative continuity. The system explains how present authority connects to an earlier source and how it is expected to continue after the current office holder. Continuity answers what happens after personal authority ends. Study the architecture of command. Legitimacy becomes durable when many institutions repeat the same underlying claim through different but compatible practices. Repeated practice matters more than occasional spectacle. The sixth mechanism is boundary maintenance. A legitimate office is usually defined not only by what it may do, but also by what it is expected to avoid. Boundaries make power recognizable as an office rather than appetite. When authority crosses those boundaries, the problem is larger than one bad decision. The act can weaken the framework that makes future commands recognizable as proper. Boundary violations can damage later commands as well. The seventh mechanism is recognition among elites, institutions, and local authorities. Legitimacy may depend on multiple centers accepting the same succession, procedure, or jurisdiction. Recognition is often distributed rather than granted once. The eighth mechanism is ordinary participation. Repeated compliance, ritual, taxation, service, judgment, or administration can reproduce legitimacy even without enthusiastic personal belief. Participation can reproduce order through habit and institutional dependence. The ninth mechanism is adaptation. A framework may preserve its central claim while changing the procedures or language used to express it under new conditions. Successful adaptation preserves identity while revising expression. Adaptation is risky because too little change can make the framework irrelevant, while too much change can make it appear opportunistic or internally contradictory. The tension is between continuity and credibility. The 10th mechanism is controlled disagreement. A durable framework needs some way to challenge decisions without automatically challenging the existence of the entire system. Disagreement channels protect both correction and continuity. That distinction allows criticism to target conduct, interpretation, or procedure while leaving room for institutional continuity. Correction becomes possible without lasting institutional rupture reliably. A useful analysis, therefore, asks where disagreement is allowed to travel. If each objection becomes disloyalty, the system may silence feedback that legitimacy needs. Silenced disagreement often returns as a larger crisis. A counterpoint is that coherence alone cannot create acceptance. Material interests, coercive capacity, habit, institutional reach, and external threats can shape compliance together. Authority is usually supported by several mechanisms at once. Legitimacy should therefore be treated as one source of authority rather than the sole cause. It interacts with incentives, fear, identity, and practical dependence. The mechanisms can reinforce or substitute for one another. Another limitation is that different groups may recognize different frameworks. What appears legitimate to one coalition may appear imposed or exclusionary to another. Legitimacy can therefore remain plural and contested. Within that context, apparent stability can hide contested authority. Public compliance does not prove private acceptance, and private acceptance does not guarantee institutional durability. Stability alone cannot tell us which framework is accepted. A conceptual case clarifies the mechanism. Imagine an office selected through a recognized process whose holder follows established boundaries and transfers authority predictably. Each component reinforces the others in observable practice. That office may retain acceptance despite unpopular decisions because participants distinguish dissatisfaction with policy from rejection of the institution itself. The institution carries more weight than one decision. The opposite case exposes fragility. If selection is disputed, conduct violates the stated principle, and succession is uncertain, each command may reopen the legitimacy question. Contradiction forces repeated commands to defend the wider system. The opening question can now be answered. Historical authority was justified by frameworks that connected a claimed source of power to recognizable procedure, expected conduct, and continuity. The framework becomes persuasive through coordinated institutional behavior. Belief mattered, but belief was reinforced by institutions. Procedures, intermediaries, boundaries, rituals, and transitions made the claim visible in repeated practice. Repetition converts abstract justification into lived expectation. Legitimacy, therefore, depends less on a single persuasive story than on whether many parts of the system keep telling the same institutional story through action. Legitimacy weakens when institutions demand belief they do not enact. When practice contradicts principle repeatedly, the framework begins to require more coercion, more explanation, or more personal loyalty to preserve obedience. Coercion often expands where recognized justification contracts. The system matters more than the myth. A powerful narrative cannot substitute for long for institutions that fail to perform the conduct the narrative demands. Institutions must repeatedly earn the meaning symbols claim. This also explains why legitimacy can survive one weak leader yet collapse under another. The decisive factor may be whether institutions absorb inconsistency or amplify it. Durability depends on where inconsistency is contained. A resilient framework allows correction. It offers procedures through which misconduct, disputed interpretation, or succession uncertainty can be addressed without dissolving the authority framework. Correction protects legitimacy by separating office from error. A brittle framework treats correction as an attack. By defending each act as necessary to the legitimacy claim, it ties the survival of the system to each individual decision. Brittleness turns ordinary mistakes into existential tests. So, the practical question is not simply, do people believe the leader? It is, which institutional relationships make this authority appear proper, bounded, and continuous? This question directs attention toward reproducible relationships. Begin by identifying the stated source of authority. Then examine whether the selection process, expected conduct, and transition rules actually support that source. Stated principle alone is insufficient by itself. Look for contradiction between principle and practice. Small inconsistencies may be absorbed, but repeated contradiction can make obedience increasingly dependent on pressure. Contradiction accumulates when no corrective path exists. Examine who carries recognition across the system. Authority rarely moves from the center directly. It is interpreted through local institutions and intermediaries. Local recognition determines how central authority is experienced. Ask where disagreement can occur without becoming rebellion. A system that cannot separate criticism from rejection may weaken its own capacity for correction. Disagreement design is therefore part of legitimacy design. The final application must remain bounded. Historical legitimacy frameworks arose under conditions that differ sharply from modern organizations, rights, institutions, and public accountability. Analogy should clarify structure without erasing historical difference. Still, one leadership question remains useful. Does authority depend on personal charisma, or can the institution explain why the role should be obeyed after that person leaves? Transferability is the practical test of institutional legitimacy. Effectiveness is not legitimacy. A coherent framework can stabilize harmful authority, so analytical clarity should not become moral endorsement. Stability does not settle the question of justice. Use this lens to examine source, selection, conduct, boundaries, recognition, correction, and succession. Together they reveal how acceptance is reproduced or weakened. These elements distinguish recognition from mere submission. The durable lesson is a question. Does the institution make authority understandable and contestable, or merely demand belief in the person holding it? The throne changes, the strategy remains. Until next time.